If you've seen me speak before, then you know I tend to start off with a question. And the question this time is, how many people know what this is? It's not a very well-phrased question. Yes, you sir. That's a good try. Yeah. I mean, it's open to interpretation, frankly. If you're a Star Wars fan, then this should give you a really big clue as to what it is. If you're not, or if it's been more than 2 weeks since you watched A New Hope, then just to give you a quick hint, that's how this plays, Maestro. There we go. To me, this image immediately makes that sound effect play in my head. It's very familiar. It's called the Wilhelm scream. It's a very famous piece of stock sound. It's used in all 6 extant Star Wars films, and we can expect to see it in the new ones because it's kind of a trademark of sound effects. It's used in all the Indiana Jones films. It's really familiar, but it's also very, very distinctive to the point that people tend to remember it because it's just a little bit weird. It's a little bit high. It sounds a bit odd. So it sticks in your mind, but people keep using it in these films now, not because it's a nice piece of background ambient sound that'll add drama, and instead because it's like a tribute to other films that you've seen, and if you know it and you're a fan and you sit in the audience going, oh, yeah, that's familiar. It's a nod to other things. And it's an interesting note because it's a good reminder to me of how you can be as distinctive and have as good a joke or as good an emotional moment as you want. And you can be very aware of when it's going to come in and kind of keep everything bubbling in a nice, non-noticeable way that the player doesn't pick up on and doesn't think, oh, that was weird, that sounded weird, what's going on there? It filters into their brain and it's a nice emotional moment. But you can also gain a great deal of benefit by being aware of what your audience is aware of and what they're going to think. And you can just wake them up a little bit by using something that's a little bit familiar or that takes them out of the experience. That doesn't necessarily make your game a bit less. It's a good reminder to me that richness and responsiveness aren't necessarily opposed, even though I said that they were in the title of this talk. So, when I heard that I'd been asked to talk here, a few months ago I wrote down a title and a bunch of descriptions of what I was going to talk about, thinking at the time, I'll definitely have an opinion on this in a few months' time. I'll just set myself a challenge. Richness versus responsiveness, that sounds... Yeah, this is something that's been percolating through my brain, and by the time I come to do the talk, I'll definitely have an opinion on it. When it came to a few weeks ago and I sat down to write this talk, I then had to work out what this actually meant, and I think I've moved on from it a little bit. We'll find out in the course of this whether I actually have an opinion on it or not. But what have I got myself into, trying to talk about richness, responsiveness, and setting up an opposition between these two? Well, this came up because I sat down, and when I became a freelancer, I decided, right, let's talk about what the role of a story is supposed to be in a game. If I'm justifying why I want to be, why games should even have story in the first place. And I'd be the first person to tell you that not all games definitely need story. But if you're going to have a story, what is the bare bones role? What can you not get away with not doing if you're going to have a story? If you boil it down, what are the bones that are left? To me, the first one of these is provide exposition and motivation for the immediate goal. If you're not doing this, then you've got no excuse not to. That's kind of the bare minimum of what your story should do. We can boil it down even further. Really, to me, this is just about establishing what are the stakes? What's going to happen if you fail? Who's at risk? What does failure mean? What is the jeopardy going on here? And, what happens if you disappear off the face of the earth and you can't save the day? The second one is something called world building. I don't have a really clear idea in my head, and I think a lot of people talk about it a lot. And there's a lot of ideas percolating around about world building, but it means lots of different things to different people. And the third one is to entertain, whether that's having a nice gag or whether that's having a nice emotional lift or an interesting moving moment. If you're writing, if your story isn't entertaining the player, then you probably don't need a story in your game because if your player hasn't noticed that the story isn't entertaining, you probably don't need a story. I'm not going to be talking about entertainment today because A, it's a really difficult and there aren't hard and fast rules, and because lots and lots of people have talked about this, people who are more qualified than me, and have talked about how to make your games memorable and how to make them funny. And I'm not going to get into that, but because I want to talk about this thing about stakes, world building. This is what loads and loads of studios invest lots of time in when it comes to story. They really put the time into the world building and really put the time into establishing what are the stakes mission to mission and what are the stakes of what is the goal of this game? What's going to happen if you don't exist? But loads and loads of games pile a lot of dialogue and a lot of storytelling components into these ideas, and yet end up with games which aren't necessarily all that interesting. So there's something going on between these two. Now, this is an example of a game that I enjoyed. This is from Far Cry 3. This character is called Bug. This is about stakes, immediate emotional stakes. The character Bug, he's very well built up as a horrible villain. He's a sort of mini-boss, basically. And he kind of administers a whole sequence of missions in which he has captured one of your friends, and is holding them in a really horrible situation, a very horrible situation, and this provides a direct personal, emotional motivation for you to go and deal with this guy. Initially you have to do what he wants, and then eventually you actually fight him. Now, I do have my problems with the way this works in the game and the way that this is depicted, and I won't get into that here. But one of the big problems is that he's a very threatening figure, and he has your friend, and he conveys the sense that horrible things are happening to your friend right now, which is why you want to complete the mission, and you want to get your friend out of it. But because it's an open world game, the minute the cutscene featuring Buck ends, you are popped right back into the open world, which means you can go around and slay as many deer as you want and spend as long as you like, not participating in that story, where nominally the game is telling you, he still has your friend. Horrible things are continuing to happen. When you go and pick up on the next mission with this character, the game pretends you rush straight there because it's essential to the jeopardy to have that sense that you need to immediately save your friend. There's the real immediacy to it. But then the open world intervenes between the two. Now, I'm not saying in any sense that mechanics should be compromised for story. I'm not a believer in that. But it's an example where they're slightly in opposition, and the one story element of immediacy just doesn't quite gel with another element, which is open world. So that's stakes. World building, I don't even know if this is from a game, I just found it. I made this point last year, loads of people have made this point. We've all saved the world a lot, we've all seen New York get blown up a lot. It doesn't have the impact that it used to. But this is part of world building, is to establish a world which is a threat, but also to establish a fun world that you want to participate in and talk to your friends about. This is another thing that people invest loads of money in, whether that's environments and textures, or whether, it's lots and lots of dialogue about how the runes work and how the magic and so forth. World building is a big part of what people invest in games. So we have these two things that people spend a lot of time on, and people are experts at establishing stakes, people are experts at building the world. But there's something in between these two which is getting squeezed out a little bit. And for me, I think that's the player. And in particular, I think it's the player, the way that the player plays the game. I'm not saying this isn't going to be another one of those, we have to remember the player guys kind of talks. Specifically, I'm talking about the way that the player has gone about saving the world. Because lots and lots of games which have great world building, and lots of games where the stakes are really clear, they've ticked off all of the things on the screenwriter's how is your story supposed to work thing. They've ticked it all off. And yet the game never responds to the way that the player plays the game. It never feels like the story is moving and shifting underneath your hands. That's because lots of studios just don't aspire to make that kind of game. That's fine. But the point that I want to try and make today is that you can aspire to have something which feels responsive, which responds to the way in which you've gone about saving the world. It's not going to cost you as much as you think, and it can get you to really interesting places, and it's relevant to a lot more games than you might think. One of the ways that you establish stakes is to look at what will happen if your character dies. That's a little trick that lots of games do. This is from Uncharted 3, where you die and somebody screams, "No, Nate." It's an interesting moment, and it's a little snapshot of a world without the player, which establishes kind of how the player works and what role their place in the world is, and it makes you want to do better, because the world will clearly be a worse place without you. But again, it's not, as much as I love these games, it doesn't go as far in what I'm talking about. Responding to the way that the player has gone about saving the world is generally something that games don't respond to. If they do, this is from BioShock 2, which is built around the concept of responding to the way you've chosen to save the world in terms of how many little sisters you save or whatever. That's really more relevant to BioShock 1, but it's better still, so I picked this one. If you have a game that's going to respond to the way it's played, that tends to be hard-coded in right from the start. Whereas I'm talking about something that you can plan in as part of your development process, which is relatively low impact, but which makes your story more responsive than you might think it can be. So my aim is to show a few cheap and easy ways to make your story and your dialogue feel more responsive. What does that actually mean? without losing this idea of richness. Okay, so what do these two things mean? Are they really opposed? Have I set this up correctly? Loads and loads of games respond to what you're doing in ways using dialogue barks. So this is an example of a dialogue bark script, and because I'm a voice director as well, this is the kind of script that I'll work with all the time, where you just get a load of different emotions, get the actor to sound them out so that you've got them, so that if you need an emotion, you can go to it and play it out. It's a way that games have and have evolved over the years of definitely responding to the way they're being played without requiring a complex amount of telemetry. You don't need to know the player has just reloaded and then has shot someone and then has reloaded and then has gone behind cover to play one of these. You just need it at the basic emotional level. And you know that you're going to require a frustrated sigh and an angry shout, depending on the type of game you're going to make. Now you can go into a lot more detail about these as another example of a script, and you can kind of take these and make them a little bit more entertaining, a little bit more striking. But you start to run into trouble the more distinctive these lines get. The top one is an example of, it's a full gag, it's something that's reasonably memorable. Whether or not that it's a good gag and appropriate, it's a memorable line because it's full of personality, it tells us something about the player. Compared to these ones, these are functionally just kind of phatic, which means to say that the word or the phrase just acts, it just performs a purely social role. If you hear someone saying fuck again and again, you'll probably be able to get away with it because that's generally the way that people use that word. Whereas a gag is something that you can really only hear once. The more distinctive a line is, the worse it gets when you repeat it. Even twice is really death to immersion. The more distinctive a line is, the worse it is when repeated. Damn it. This brings us onto the Wilhelm scream. It's just a bit too distinctive. It stands out. There are other very famous stock sound effects, like something called the Kishabaf, which is a sound that almost everything in Hollywood makes when you set it on fire. It goes Kishabaf. But people aren't aware of it because it doesn't stand out as much because it's a very ambient piece of audio. Only real audio geeks know about it. The more distinctive a line is, the worse it is when it's repeated. Damn it. So we've got this idea of if you have a really rich line that's really memorable and adds to your world, the more rich it is, the less it can be reused. But if you're trying to be really responsive instead, if you have something that's really micro and it just means you have an emotional response for everything, frustrated noise, sigh, anger, the more redundant it is, the more that you respond specifically to what the player is doing, the more you're building redundancy into your game and in particular into your dialogue. So let's take a really basic story as an example of this. Let's say you've slain the ravening man-wolf and you have seduced the feeble ingenue, but you've decided not to meet the feeble ingenue's dad. So you've gone through this path, yes, yes, no, and as a result of that logic path, the engine searches for and plays a specific piece of dialogue. At that point, you've got a load of paths that you've already ruled out, which presumably you have to have dialogue for as well. So those have become redundant. There's a high level of redundancy the more you're responding specifically to what the player has done. Now, you might be thinking, this is therefore not relevant to me, because this is only relevant to RPGs. It's not relevant to my action game, or it's not relevant to my sports game, because it's only relevant to those non-linear games. And I don't think that's true, because I can give you an example of where we use a little bit of telemetry in games that almost all of us play, and we respond to the way the player has chosen to play it. We reward them for the way they've chosen to play it, and we encourage them to think of a different way that they could have played it. And it's present in almost every modern game in one form or another. It can be summed up in 2 words. Beep, beep. That telemetry probably already exists in your game. The data tracking to keep track of the way it's been played is already there. Imagine a game which not only gave you an award for playing it in a certain way, but also responded and tonally modulated the story in a way that showed that the story was aware of how it was being played. Let's take the Buck example again. If he told you he's got your friend captive, you've gone off and you've slain a bunch of deer and you come back and started again with the next stage of the mission. Imagine if it was just a question of 2 lines, one way or the other. If you've taken a given amount of time between the missions, it's easy to track that. Then you have him say to the player, where were you? I guess you don't care about your friend at all. Now your player is most likely going to say, no, I just didn't know you were keeping track of me. How dare you? That's not what's going on at all. This isn't about imposing a judgment on the player. You don't have to say, you don't care about this person, so they're dead. You don't have to impose that judgment. You can just challenge the player to go, right, so I guess you don't care about this person? And the player is invited to say, no, I do. I'm choosing to play it this way. You can even sit there and have the player respond. No, I went off and slew a bunch of deer, so I'm ready when I need to kill you. Because I'm doing my Rambo thing, and I made a tactical decision. And at that point, the gameplay and the story have come together. You're not just playing the game. The story doesn't pause after every cutscene. The story becomes part of everything that you do. This is what I'm talking about with emotional telemetry, which, if you read the description of the talk, was something that I put in. I didn't fully know what I meant by this when I put it in the description. I've fleshed it out a bit, and there's a lot more work to be done, but this is what I mean. The benefits of doing it are really clear. So Paul from Mode 7 Games very kindly let me use a screenshot from their current beta of Frozen End Zone. This is just, it's banter. These are the commentators from a sci-fi sports game. And they talk about the chances that one team has to win based on the current state of play. But then in addition, the coach of the side that's, say, losing has an opportunity. I mean, this is not controlled. This is all controlled by logic. The coach comes in and says, no, you reckon I'm going to lose because I'm 9-1 down, let's say, or whatever the hell that score was. And instead I'm going to come back from this. So there's logic at work in the back end, which generates something really interesting, which makes the game feel like it's aware of how it's being played. Similarly, Bastion, one of my favourite games of a couple of years ago. The best moments in it were where you smash a bunch of chests and boxes, because in games you smash chests and boxes and you're expecting to find coins in them. But at certain moments, this wonderful narrator who sits at the back of the game also says, sometimes you just gotta wail on things for a while. And it puts an emotional context behind something that you thought you were doing purely for a game reason. It makes a tactical decision into a game emotional decision. There's bits and pieces of this in Transistor as well, and I have to say, Transistor is a magnificent game because the gameplay is brilliantly designed. Bastion was a fairly straightforward game that was really lifted by the narration and is amazing. Transistor is probably a better game, but it also did this, but it had slightly less of those moments where it makes you aware that the game is aware of how it's being played and made you question if you could be playing it in another way. And I was sad to see that emphasised slightly less in Transistor. What we're talking about is resourcing. So if there are any producers in the room, yes, resourcing, because we're talking about doing two things where one would do. But I think the rewards are there. And ultimately, if you're talking about dialogue, I mean, I've been a dialogue pipeline manager, I've done all of that, and it's a difficult job, and dialogue assets are not worthless. But compared to almost anything else in the game, talk is cheap. Eliminating redundancy makes your game less reactive. If you have a very low tolerance for redundancy in your production, if you know you're only going to make things that the player is definitely going to see, then your game will react less to the way it is being played. That would have been a better title for this. Redundancy versus reactivity. If I'd thought about it, if I'd thought through my ideas months ago, I would have put the title down as redundancy versus reactivity, some inexpensive ways to make your game sound more like people. If only I'd had the wit to put that on, because that title really would have brought the punters in, right? This isn't about doing things with more words, necessarily, because more words aren't necessarily going to make your game better. It's about doing more with the words that you have, targeting your assets. So the takeaway from this is going to be about how to use your voice resources and your story resources to be more reactive without adding words. My aspiration is to show that you can use targeted assets for story to make games feel more responsive without brute forcing it, which means without writing a 1,000-line bark script that has every possible emotion that you might possibly need, and then getting it all recorded and getting it all localized. Instead, it's about looking forward, spotting where you're going to need those emotional clinches, where you're going to need to respond to the way the player is playing it, doing something minimal but effective, and introducing maybe two things where one traditionally would have worked. The takeaway is going to be, how do you make the most of your dialogue resources? Well, I think there's three elements to this. One, you need to identify your emotional clinches in your game. Two, you need to plan ahead and plan for the unplannable. I'll go into a bit of detail about that, but yeah, that's a tricky one. And three, using a flexible database-driven dialogue methodology. I'll go into a bit of detail about this, but it's mostly going to be about the philosophy and the approach of how you do it, because lots of studios will have different ways of doing this. It's relevant to different games. I have a methodology that I like to work with and can kind of bring and show people. And I talked about that in more detail last year, and some of that talk is online. So if you want to find out a little bit more about that, it's there. Identifying your emotional clinches. What does this actually mean? Again, this isn't about getting out Save the Cat and talking to you about structure, because that was a valuable conversation for the games industry to have however many years ago. I'm talking about something quite specific. A good place to start is the razor statement, and usefully, that is almost certainly already done on your game. The razor statement is a short summary of what the game is supposed to be about and what it's doing. If you look at it and highlight the emotional elements of it, and look at all of these emotional words, and you can then say any moment in the game which is supposed to be contributing to or fulfilling one of these words, that's an emotional clinch. It doesn't necessarily have to be with action games exclusively. If you look at a strategy game, and you're trying to build an emotional context around that, and you want to add in some responsive dialogue, okay, my strategy game is about building a space empire, identifying weaknesses, achieving galactic supremacy. The moment where you achieve this, or the moment where you're about to achieve galactic supremacy, is the kind of emotional clinch moment where you might want to think about adding in something that responds to the way the game has been played. Ask the player, could they have done it differently? This is kind of an inexact science, though. This is all creator speak. And it's also very development focused. So let's look at it from the player's perspective. And this is where we can learn usefully from screenwriting and listen to narrative and think about the kinds of questions that screenwriters have evolved. These are the death questions that if someone is sitting there and asking, your screenplay is already dead. Identify your emotional clinches by working out what questions is a bored player going to be asking themselves and when. If they're going to mess with your story a little bit and they've lost interest, they might ask, why are these people friends again? They might ask, why doesn't Frodo just give up and go home? Or the ultimate QA tester's question, why am I doing this again? If these come up in a film, it's absolute death. So the terrified screenwriter will tend to ask, how do I answer this question before the audience asks it? I need to have fulfilled this and make sure it's not coming up. I think that the terrified game writer has an added opportunity. They have the opportunity to ask, how do I find an answer to this in what the player has done and what the player has emotionally invested into the game? Even if the player wasn't aware that they were emotionally investing in the game, they thought they were just making tactical decisions. You can characterize your player, even if it's a question of just saying, you seem to be a very tactical person, you're taking everything in your stride, you're not stopping to help all of those innocents, you're just powering on with it. That's interesting. The questions that you can make your player ask themselves, which are way more interesting, is questions like this. But at what cost? Was this really what you wanted? Did you have to do it this way? Now, this isn't necessarily about adding in a bunch of good, evil, binary decisions or narratives where it isn't appropriate to your game. This isn't a comment on any Star Wars game. It's just that in my head, this is what good and evil look like. This isn't about just adding in a choice if it's inappropriate. It's about taking the story out of the cutscene and letting it flow on into the game and making sure that the player doesn't inhale story during the cutscene. Cutscene ends and they relax. They're no longer in story mode. Or more likely, they relax during the cutscenes. Oh, story is going to happen. And then they pick up because they're back in the game. Instead, I think, by asking these questions of the player and responding to the way they played it, you can make them carry the story with them through gameplay. It looks like this. So instead of having a play phase and a bit of a story phase and then a play phase and a bit of a story phase, when you start asking these responsive questions, why did you do it that way? Why did it take so long to get here? Not necessarily accusing the player of anything, but making them think about these questions. Instead, you have play phases that then have story that mounts up, and you carry the story with you through each of your play phases. Because instead of just being purely a tactical mode, a tactical moment when you're playing the game, it's a tactical moment, but you know that the game is paying attention, and the story might ask you, why are you playing it this way? That's interesting. You might ask these questions. Oh, so you prefer stealth, do you? Okay, that tells me something about you. It's not necessarily true. The player is always open to defend themselves and say, no, I'm doing stealth, not because I'm scared, but because I think it's the best way to do things. But you make them respond and invest emotionally the minute you start asking these questions. And again, this is about one line of dialogue varying between two states at the start of a cutscene, but it will wake your player up and make them realize that the game is paying attention. And and the story is moving under their hands. If you show that the story is aware of how it's being played, to me that's a living story. And that's the difference between not just taking a non-linear game that's happy being non-linear because it wants to tell a certain story, but then adding in just a bit of tonal variation which shows that even if you still get to the same endpoint, it's a game which still asks you, are you playing this in a way that tells me something about you?